Acts 21, and we're going to start at verse 27, which in the church Bibles is under the heading Paul arrested. It's also going to be up on the screen behind me. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus, and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. 'What shall I do, Lord?' I asked. 'Get up,' the Lord said, 'and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do.' My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very moment I was able to see him. Then he said, 'The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all the people of what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name.' When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. 'Quick,' he said, 'leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me.' 'Lord,' I replied, 'these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, "Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles." The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains.
Father, we thank you that your word is living and active, that it is sharper than any two-edged sword, that it divides soul and spirit, joint and marrow, that it exposes the thoughts and intentions of our hearts and lays them bare before you, to whom we must give an account. And I pray that be our experience this morning, that as we hear your word now, that you, the master surgeon, might go to work in our hearts, cutting away the sin that so easily entangles, and restoring faith in Christ. Please would we cling to him more deeply. Correct, rebuke, encourage us. Give us what we need this morning, because I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're in, if you weren't here last week, just to fill you in, we're in our final season, if you like, in the book of Acts, looking at the last 8 chapters, as Paul makes his way from Jerusalem and ends up in Rome. And as we've been working our way through this whole book of Acts, we've been watching the message about Jesus go from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. Luke's written this sort of second volume to his Gospel of Luke to show us, to give us confidence that Jesus is continuing his work of seeking and saving the lost. The work that he started in his own ministry, but as we've sung this morning in one of our earlier songs, that he continues to do through his Spirit-empowered people as they trust in and proclaim the message that Jesus is Lord to the nations. And in these final chapters, Luke, we're sort of taken into Luke's diary. He gives us diary entry after diary entry of his journey with Paul, and these extraordinary stories of Paul, as we've just read, of being beaten, of being tried, and having to give defense of his ministry. And it's not just that, it's not like Paul's, PowerPoint of his, Luke's PowerPoint of his journey. It's not like a slideshow of, this is interesting. No, there's a sort of a theological agenda. He wants to give us confidence. He wants to grow our convictions that Jesus' ministry is unstoppable. It will go to the ends of the earth, and this is what it will look like as he continues that ministry. And the first thing we see is Paul gets arrested down in verse 27, and this sort of awful situation occurs with the crowd. Is that a feature of the message going to the nations is that God's people, and particularly Paul here, will face unfair criticism just like Jesus. Look down at verse 27. We left Paul last week. He'd done this really generous thing of following the leaders of the church at Jerusalem, their request to go with these Jewish believers to perform this Nazirite vow. And Paul's done that. He spent a week in the temple being with these guys, showing that he's not anti-Jewish, he's not anti-Jewish culture, but he's right behind it. Then in verse 27, these 7 days were nearly over. It seems like all might have worked until these Jewish believers from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple, and they kick off. It's these Jewish believers. They've come from Ephesus. If you remember when we looked at Ephesus back in chapter 19, it seems like these same opponents have followed Paul, it seems, to Jerusalem and want to stir up a riot. It seems like they've seen Timotheus with him at some other point in the city, and so they've used that to make this criticism against Paul that he's sort of not only anti-Jewish, but he wants to destroy the temple. He wants to bring the whole thing down. It's really unfair what happens here, this criticism that Paul takes. We've known all the way through the book of Acts, particularly from chapter 15, he's not anti-Jewish. He's not out to ruin the temple. No, he's been given this commission by Jesus, as we'll look at in a minute, to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And so Paul faces this unfair criticism. In fact, it's not just unfair criticism, is it? It's not like someone's just written an article about him. It's horrendous what happens. The crowd sees him, and they beat him up. They're trying to kill him. They want to get rid of him. He's so badly beaten, it seems that the soldiers, in order to get him out, have to carry him to the garrison. And Luke, as he writes, wants us to see that this is what it might be like for God's people as they want to share Jesus to the world. This kind of opposition, this unfair criticism, this opposition will come. And it doesn't take much to look through church history to see that. And perhaps that's your experience this morning, of facing or knowing about people facing unfair criticism because of their testimony about Jesus. I remember one instance when I worked for UCCF down in Cambridge, that the Christian Union there put on a series of events, an events week to talk about Jesus publicly, to answer people's questions, to take people through one of the Gospels so that people could find out for themselves who Jesus was and all that he'd done. And as the advertisements went out, all through the build-up to that events week, over a couple of months, the student newspaper ran a series of articles written by people that really didn't want that mission week or that events week to happen. There were all sorts of horrible accusations made against these 18, 19-year-old students who were seeking to put on this events week. Accusations of being sort of arrogant or intolerant or homophobic or any list of things. All the articles were written by people that hadn't been to a single event yet, but they'd made up their mind. These people are bad for the students. They're dangerous. We need to keep them quiet. Now, that's not unusual, sadly, is it? It's often the way that in our culture, particularly, we want to undermine people that we disagree with. You just have to look at political news this week to see that. That the way to tear people down is to make these accusations, to undermine them in public. The interesting thing about the situation in Cambridge is that one of the main people that ran the newspaper decided that they would come to all of the events during the events week to find out for themselves, and then wrote a really wonderful piece about the CU, and actually they weren't all of the things that they'd been accused of, and it was a really interesting week, though they disagreed with what was said. That's not what happens here, though, is it? Notice what Luke tells us. Look down at verse 28. Paul's there, and people are screaming, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." You see why they don't like Paul? It's because of his mission of joining Jesus in seeking and saving the lost. This man teaches everyone everywhere. That's what they hate. These same opponents who back in Ephesus, you remember in chapter 19, didn't like what Paul was saying about Jesus, not because they had any argument against the message, but because the businesses were losing money because people were becoming Christians. They were leaving the temple, or leaving the idol worship in their city. That's what's going on here. They don't like the fact that the gospel is taking hold of people's lives. Now, why does Luke want us to know it? Why does he share this story of opposition? Why does Theophilus, his sort of intended reader in chapter 1, need to hear this? Well, I think it's because Luke wants us to see this is what we should expect as the message about Jesus makes inroads into new places. Opposition comes. And that opposition will include unfair criticism, unfair accusations. Now, the issue here is about Gentiles becoming Christians without first becoming Jewish. See, in the Bible, Jewish people would have been happy for non-Jewish people to become Jewish. That's all the way through the Bible. It's part of the Bible's story. People like Ruth, who joins Naomi's family, for example, a Moabite woman, and is integral to the Bible story. Or Rahab, who helps the spies in the book of Joshua. Like, Gentile to Jew is fine. But the idea that Paul, a Jewish man, might say that God's promises are for Gentiles as well without them first becoming Jewish, well, that makes their blood boil. Now, we're not obviously in the same situation, but the principle here is something we need to understand and have in our sort of convictional base, if you like, that as we speak about Jesus, as we live for him in our culture, in our time, we will upset some of the things that society loves because of our trust in Jesus. It's inevitable because we're saying that he's Lord. And I guess the question for us is, are we ready for that? Is that something that you're willing to accept as a disciple of Jesus? That the message that Jesus Christ is Lord is a message that some people won't want to hear and will want to stop us from saying it. Maybe it brings to mind, it certainly brought to mind what Peter says in his letter, at the end of his letter. He says, don't be surprised when the fiery trial, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed. Don't be surprised. That's Luke's message here, I think. Luke wants us to see that as the message about Jesus makes its way out into the nations, into your friends, as you speak about him to your friends and neighbors and colleagues, a feature of Christian experience is that unfair criticism will come, opposition will come. Now, we can be thankful that in our culture, that opposition is, no one's going to beat us up. Not yet, anyway. No one's throwing us into prison. Not yet, anyway. But it can be really difficult, can't it? I wonder if that's, certainly for me, it's one of the reasons that I'm often slow to speak to friends or to avoid certain conversations with people because you kind of know what's going to come. I may be fearful of losing a friendship. Yeah, happy to talk about church, happy to talk about being part of a lovely community, glad to build relationships with people, to enjoy friendship, but when the conversation turns to the lordship of Jesus in a particular area of life, we just go quiet, back off. Because we know that perhaps some sort of unfair criticism is coming. We've seen it in our cancel culture world. We're afraid. And Luke says, well, don't be surprised. That's a feature of the gospel going to the nations. It's not inevitable. There's moments of peace in the book of Acts where the gospel spreads and there's no opposition. It's not going to happen every time, but we need to be ready for it. All sorts of things get in Paul's way as he tries to get the gospel, as he works on taking the gospel to Rome. We're going to see this. There's going to be people that oppose him, leaders that oppose him, situations like shipwrecks that seem to conspire against him. He's going to get bitten by a snake. And all sorts of things are going to happen to Paul as he tries to join Jesus on his mission. And Luke will keep saying to us, don't be surprised. This is what it looks like. See, the reality is that we, like Paul, follow the way of the Master, the Lord Jesus. That's the big idea, isn't it? And you can't really miss it as you hear the story, as you read it, that Paul is just like Jesus. Remember, Jesus is accused of threatening the temple, of ruining it, of tearing it down. Jesus is falsely accused with a crowd riled up against him, calling for his death. People crying, "Away with him, crucify him." Paul is just like Jesus, isn't he? This is the continuing work of Jesus. Paul is becoming like him in his sufferings. So don't be surprised. It's not unusual. Don't assume it's all going wrong. It will be hard. It will be painful. But that's what the mission of Jesus looks like as we join in with him. It's what happened to Jesus. It's what happened to Paul. And it will be what happens to his people. We've got a lot of freedom in our culture. It's wonderful freedom, really. And we can think that's kind of normal, but when you look back through church history, the freedoms that we enjoy are just really unusual. They're actually unusual globally today. Most of the places where the gospel is growing, there's fierce opposition to it. We're the unusual ones with our freedoms, both geographically and historically. Normally, the normal means is of the gospel going out is through, it will create this kind of opposition. So Paul faced unfair criticism just like Jesus, and so will we. We need to grow in our convictions about that if we're going to be speaking about him. But the second big thing we see is that Paul loved his enemies just like Jesus. It's striking, isn't it, as Andy read it to us, that Paul doesn't seem to think that everything that's happening to him is this dreadful crisis that we might think it is. In fact, what he does is pretty remarkable, isn't it? He's faced a beating so bad that the Roman soldiers have had to sort of carry him out. He's under arrest. He's about to be flogged. This baying mob are trying to kill him. And the only reason he can escape is because the soldiers arrive to break up the violence. Like the whole town has gathered. That's what Luke says. Everyone's there rushing, seeking to get rid of Paul. I don't know if you can kind of imagine what that must have been like, how terrifying that must be like. As someone that plays rugby, I've been present at a few moments when things have boiled over on the pitch, where punches get thrown and handbags are raised. And it can, even in that environment, be quite unsettling. I tend to find it quite funny and just sort of walk away. But sort of seeing it can be quite scary. Angry people resorting to violence. Maybe you've seen that in Nottingham if you've been out in an evening and seen a fight break out or something like that. But this is not a moment of sort of isolated violence, is it? It's not a moment of road rage that's a bit unsettling. No, this is a mob, a whole town, who feel that their holy site is being desecrated by Paul, and they want blood. And so they beat him. They're trying to kill him. And it's only the soldiers from this garrison, probably up to 100 soldiers that were stationed at the temple, who would come out and sort of dispel the violence, and Paul is rescued. But what's kind of remarkable is that Paul wants to address the crowd. This is not a dreadful opportunity. This is not a dreadful situation that, let me escape. Let's get out of here. Let's go on to the next thing. No, this is an opportunity now, provided by the soldiers for him to speak to his brothers and fathers, which is what he calls them. Look down at chapter 22, verse 1. 21, verse 40. After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd, and when they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." Listen to my defense. The Greek word there is apologia, which is where we get our term apologetics. It just means to give a reasoned defense. That's what he wants to do. He wants to go straight towards the unfair criticism and defend himself. And simply, calmly, he tells them his story of how he's got to where he's got to. But notice how he tells his story. He calls them brothers and fathers, these people that have just tried to kill him and beaten him up. He speaks to them in their language. He speaks in Aramaic. He puts himself in their shoes. He says, look, I'm just like you. I was just like you. All the things that are driving you today at this moment to do what you're doing, I was just like that. In fact, I had even more zeal than all of you. I was trained and discipled by the most highly respected Jewish leaders of the day. And he names those people and those councils and those places. They would have known that. They've been familiar to them. So he identifies with them. He puts himself in their shoes and speaks their language and says, look, I'm actually just like you. But then notice, as he tells his conversion story, he wants them to see that what he's doing is in keeping with all of the Old Testament promises. Just like Old Testament prophets encountered the Lord and had a message from the Lord to speak, so Paul has been appointed by Jesus, by the Lord, through this amazing conversion story as Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus. But notice that Jesus gives him a message to testify about the Abrahamic promises. That's what Ananias says, to testify to the righteous one, the servant of Isaiah 52 and 53. In other words, he wants them to see that in no way is he abandoning the Old Testament heritage. That's why we sang the song that we did. He wants them to see that Jesus is the true and better Adam, the true and better Moses, the true and better David, the true and better Isaac. All of this is fulfilled in Jesus. I'm not anti-Jewish. Jesus is the Messiah. He's the one I'm testifying about. What I'm saying is nothing new. It's in line with what God has always said. And what I'm saying is not something I've made up. It's not my new invention. It's been given to me by the Lord to speak and proclaim amongst the nations. See, Paul's saying, look, I'm just like the other apostles, if you like. I've been transformed and commissioned by meeting Jesus and by being given this mission to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. It's a familiar theme through the book of Acts. Luke wants us to know that Paul is Jesus' man. What Paul says Jesus says, to listen to Paul is to listen to Jesus. We've said that a few times as we've gone through the book of Acts. But what I want to focus on this morning is not so much that, though that's really important, but is Paul's attitude to his opponents. Because it's really striking, isn't it? To see how generous he is towards them. It's interesting, there's 3 times in the book of Acts we get Paul's testimony, twice from Paul and once from Luke in chapter 9. And what's fascinating is the different ways that it's told depending on who's being told it. And here, as he tells his story, he speaks to them to say, look, the accusations that you're giving, it's not fair. That's not who I am. That's not what I'm doing. In other words, he tells his story for their benefit. It's so counterintuitive for us, isn't it? I mean, just think about how different our political discourse would be if whenever a politician came up and to speak to the people that disagree with them and just thought, no, I need to speak in a way that really helps them understand what I'm going to say on their terms, with their questions, with their objections. It'd be remarkable to behave like that, wouldn't it? And that's what Paul does here. It's so easy for us when we're confronted by people that disagree with us, that oppose us, that think differently to us, that, well, we can do one of two things, I guess. We could demand our rights of freedom of speech. It's my right to say this out loud in the way that I'll say it. That's enshrined in law. Let's defend that. Or it's easy to become quite self-righteous. to hide away and to think, oh, they're just bad, they don't get it, let's not bother with them, let's give up. That's not what Paul does he? Like, he goes towards their objections. He seeks to address them head on. He loves his enemies. Just like Jesus before him, who's, as he's being nailed to the cross, is praying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. So here's Paul, just like Jesus, loving his enemies, desperate for them to understand that Jesus is their Messiah and that they should trust him. See, we're so afraid of the unfair criticism that we start to stop. We just stop talking about Jesus, don't we? Maybe that's your experience. Maybe you think, if I just be a good friend, if I could just be a really nice neighbor, if I can be a great colleague, then perhaps people eventually say, oh, Christianity, that's something I want in my life because you're so lovely. That's not how it works. When Jesus says you're the light of the world or you're the salt of the earth, he doesn't mean just be brilliant people and people will become Christians. No, Jesus was the light of the world and they crucified him. That's not what that verse means. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be good neighbors or good friends, but we've got to talk about Jesus. I'm not saying we should become weird or just speak irrespective of who we're talking to. I'm not saying we shouldn't be wise or creative and thoughtful in the way that we do it. No, that's exactly what Paul does here. He's careful and thoughtful about who he's speaking to. But Paul speaks, doesn't he? He moves towards those that disagree with him. And he says, you've got to understand this. See, how will the message about Jesus get to the ends of the earth? It is through his Spirit-empowered witnesses speaking about the lordship of Jesus and speaking about him even to those that oppose us, even if it costs us a great deal. Because that's what Jesus does. And we're to be just like Jesus because Jesus is the one who's continuing his work, seeking and saving the lost through his Spirit-empowered witnesses as they speak the message about him. Got to grow in our convictions about this, otherwise we'll just stay silent, or we'll think we're doing it wrong when we're opposed, or we'll think we'll have to change the message in order to be heard. No, speak about Jesus. Don't mishear me, this is not a call to seek out opposition at all costs. We see that actually at the end of this chapter. We haven't got time to really focus on it, but notice that Paul doesn't, he's not like, oh, give me the flogging then. He's like, hang on a minute, I'm a Roman citizen, you can't do that. No, he's careful, isn't he? It's not just suffering at all costs. No, he's wise in the way that he does it, but he uses the situation he's in and the person that God has made him in the place that God has put him and speaks about Jesus in the best way that he can. You see the point that Luke is making as he recounts this for us. In this wonderful narrative, God is keeping his messenger, fulfilling his purposes of getting his message to the ends of the earth. And he'll keep us. Whatever the cost is, he will keep us as we seek to be faithful to him. Now, it doesn't mean we'll always be protected from every bad situation. Paul certainly isn't protected here completely, is he? God keeps him, but he does receive quite a beating. Like there really is a shipwreck. He really does get bitten by a snake, but God keeps keeping him. I don't think we're to think, well, we'll get an easy ride. No, that's not the point. Stephen is mentioned in this passage, and he was faithful in Acts 7, and he died, bearing witness to Jesus. No, the point, though, is that Jesus is continuing his work of seeking and saving the lost. And people will oppose that message, but we're to keep speaking it. Now, that might be scary for you this morning. It might be just a bit scary to think about, going back into work after the Easter break and bumping into colleagues, coming under all sorts of pressure, maybe even encountering unfair criticism. But friends, the Lord will keep us. We'll see next week that the Lord stands by our side as we do it. It's his gospel that's unstoppable, and we can trust him. We'll face opposition just like Jesus, but we're to keep loving our enemies just like Jesus as we continue to speak of him. Let me lead us in a prayer before we sing. If the band wants to come up, that'd be great. Maybe just take a minute in the silence. What's God been saying to you? Maybe the Lord's brought to mind someone that's particularly opposing you or been unfair towards you. Maybe it's a good opportunity to pray for them, to ask that you'd be just like Jesus. Maybe it's some colleagues that you'd love to share Christ with, or family member that you've just avoided talking to because you're fearful of what might come. Just lift that up to King Jesus. Talk to him about it. And then I'll pray in a second.